A large employer in South Beloit prepares to shut down one of its facilities, a move that will affect about 150 workers in the coming months. South Beloit braces to lose a long-running cookie production plant operated by Treehouse Foods. The company says it plans to wind down operations at the site and leaves dozens of stateline families to face uncertainty about their next steps. Treehouse is being sold to an investment firm overseas, but officials say the shutdown stems from internal planning and not the acquisition.
People are working locally, whether that's, right here in South Beloit or within driving distance. But yeah, it's a lot of jobs. It's unfortunate. These things do happen, and we're just hoping that the next, regiment of some sort of snack or cookie manufacturing entity might end up in that building and try to get some of those people that were working there previously employed again.